Hey everyone, and welcome to this Dota 2 beginner's guide on disables. Disables are incredibly important for a Dota 2 player to understand because they have an immense impact at every stage of the game. Whether you are fighting for a bounty rune, or laning against an opposing hero, or in a major team fight, these abilities have major impacts on the game all throughout, and it's so important you understand how they function and how they can impact you and the opposition. So, let's get started with the king of all disables. The stun. The stun is without question the strongest disable in the game. In fact, a lot of people go as far as during the draft to ensure that the team is drafted with enough stuns in hand to ensure that they can have the greatest impact on the game. Stuns prevent everything. Prevent movement. They prevent attacks. They prevent abilities and items. They prevent everything. When you are stunned, you are at your most vulnerable state. And that is important to understand. Stuns cancel channeled abilities. Stuns cancel channeled spells. Stuns cancel everything. Stuns are completely locking down heroes and then punishing them for it. They are without question the strongest disable in the game. And as a result, you often see heroes drafted specifically because of their stuns. Stormhammer on Sven is a perfect example, right? Stormhammer is a very effective stun that allows Sven to do a lot of work in lane and in the late game. And as such, Sven is often drafted with Stormhammer in mind. It is a key component to his kit. There are other stuns as well, like Ogre Magi has a stun, and Vengeful Spirit has a stun. There's a lot of heroes that have stuns, and it's very important that you come to an understanding as to which heroes have stuns so that you can prioritize them in your games in order to have the greatest impact. Because quite frankly, stuns are invaluable in Dota 2. Moving on to the next type of disable, we're talking about movement slows, not as extreme as a stun, but still very effective. The difference between movement slows and stuns is that, well, you can still attack if you're slowed. You can still use abilities and items. Sure. Your movement's just slowed, obviously. Now, a couple things that are important to understand, though. Unlike most stuns are single target. There are examples like Tidehunter's Ravage and things along those lines, but most are single target. Crystal Nova is a targeted area slow, which can slow like an entire team if they're in that targeted area. It's also important to understand that movement slows are percentage based, okay? That means that they operate on a percentage of a hero's complete speed or movement speed. That's important to understand because attack slows operate very differently. So percentage based movement slows are the way Dota 2 works, and it's also important to understand that if a unit has haste, like a haste rune, they will be unaffected by movement slows. They're basically invulnerable to movement slows. Good to know, because if you got a haste in a bottle and you get slowed and you're about to die, use that haste and get out of there. Get out of there. Attack slows. We've got Viper here. We'll be talking about Viper again soon, but Corrosive Skin is a great example of an attack slow because what it does is every time you attack Viper, well, you get an attack slow. The other thing is Crystal Nova, the skill we just spoke about on Crystal Maiden, also has an attack slow as well as a movement slow. This one has to be a passive ability on Viper. Now, it does not impede movement. It doesn't impede ability usage or items, but it does slow down the attack. Unlike movement slows, which are percentage based, attack speeds cannot be reduced to less than 20, so you can't just reduce someone's attack speed to the point they cannot attack. That's called a Disarm, which we'll talk about later. And attack speed slows are hit by flat values, so they're not percentage based. They are flat values that are applied to an opposing unit. Now let's talk about silence. Silence is incredibly important in Dota 2 because it has the ability to completely change a team fight, especially against enemy spellcasters. Now Silencer has a global silence, but let's talk about Drow Ranger's Gust here. Drow Ranger is a little more popular amongst the newer players. Drow Ranger's Gust is an incredible ability because you can use it proactively or reactively depending on the situation. Let's take this for example. We've been talking about Crystal Maiden. Let's say Crystal Maiden's Freezing Field is ready to be cast. She blinks into your team. Okay, she's ready to cast her ultimate, and then you gust her. That prevents her from casting any spells for 3 to 6 seconds, and she's basically dead because she's very vulnerable without any spell casting. Let's take another scenario. Let's say she blinks in and she's invisible because she has a Glimmer Cape. You know roughly where she is, but you can't see her, you can't attack her, and her ult is going off. You can gust into her general direction, and you can completely silence her, nullifying her ult, even without seeing her, and you can cancel her channeled ability. It's incredibly important that you understand that because it is invaluable to silence channeled abilities because it will save your skin more often than you would believe. It's also important to understand that passive abilities are not disabled during the silence, just active casting of abilities. Break. Break's a fantastic one as well. Break is one of those abilities that disables passives like Bristleback, and Enchantress is Untouchable. It will not disable passives from talents or items, however. So for instance, if a Phantom Assassin has Blur, that will be disabled, but the Talisman of Evasion, which has a percentage-based opportunity for opponents to miss attacks on you, would not be disabled. And a perfect example of this skill is Nether Toxin by Viper. I love Viper. I always talk about Viper. We talked about his corrosive skin before. Now we're talking about Nether Toxin. And Viper applies the break effect with Nether Toxin, which would disable these effects. And for instance, in the case of Bristleback would honestly make one of his primary abilities, his ability to be extremely tanky and threatening, he would just dissipates. He's no longer that tanky menace that you're scared to try and hit. You can just hit him all you want now because he's basically broken. So it's very important that you understand how those abilities can impact fights. Now let's talk about Mute. I'm using Static Storm as an example because Static Storm is a silence that can then be upgraded to a mute using Aghanim's Scepter, and it is fantastic because it is similar to a silence, except silencing disables ability usage, muting disables item usage. Very important differentiation. And the key thing here is Static Storm can do both when upgraded with the Aghanim's Scepter. It will not disable items with passive effects, so like the Talisman of Evasion again. It will cancel channeled items like a Meteor Hammer. It will prevent the use of items, and it will not dispel ongoing effects. That's important to understand. So for instance, let's say someone has a BKB, Black King Bar, makes them spell immune. If they get hit with Static Storm first, they will take the damage and the silence and mute effects and not be able to activate their BKB. However, if they apply the BKB before they get hit with the Static Storm, they are invulnerable to both effects because they had the BKB on before Static Storm was applied to them, so the item was not muted before they were hit. So that's important to understand as well. So timing with mute can be very important. Force movement. Force movement is really awesome and frustrating at the same time. The Meat Hook from Pudge is one of the most famous abilities in Dota 2 for its ability to take you forcibly and pull you wherever the enemy team wants you, wherever that enemy Pudge wants you. It'll take you through terrain, it'll take you up a hill, it'll take you down a hill, it'll take you wherever it has to take you. You cannot move, you can't attack, you can't use abilities, you can't use items. You are donezo, you are Pudges, and he's gonna eat you up. And it's awesome because yeah, I mean, it's awesome if you're the one pulling the Pudge, but if you're Pudge pulling, but if you are getting pulled by Pudge, not so awesome. There's important differentiation though. There are some abilities that are force movement that do not completely prevent attacks, items, or item usage. An example of this is Keeper of the Light's Blinding Light and Drow's Gust, which silences and has a knockback effect, but does not really prevent, attacking or ability usage or item usage. You can still pop a BKB, for instance, okay? Those abilities will kind of like forcibly relocate you, but they won't completely force you like without action. All right. Important differentiation. Meat Hook though with Pudge, man, that is an absolute beauty. Blind. We were just talking about Blinding Light. And what Blinding Light does is it makes a unit attack miss. So basically, if an attack misses, it completely negates the impact, which also prevents any attack modifiers or on-hit effects from triggering. So for instance, if let's say a Faceless Void has a Maelstrom, which has a percentage chance at ability to kind of do electrical damage in a field around them, if they cannot actually physically hit a unit, they cannot proc that opportunity. They cannot proc Maelstrom. Maelstrom will not ever apply because they're not physically impacting. It's the opposite. Let's say someone has like infinite armor and you're hitting them but not doing damage. Maelstrom will still kind of, the effect will still occur. But if you cannot impact them, if you're missing every single time, you cannot apply that effect. So it's very important to understand, and Blinding Light is a perfect example of that. 70% miss chance, very significant, often overlooked. An incredible ability, one of the best. Love it. Absolutely love it. Fear. Fear is very similar to force movement. You are forced to move. You cannot attack, use abilities, or use items, and all your kind of queued commands or whatever you happen to be doing is canceled, and you are forced to run towards your fountain. There's a few abilities that do this. It's not very common. It's seen in Savage Roar and Lone Druid. You can. There's a talent for Queen of Pain, which will allow that effect to be applied as well. Dark Willow can do it. There's a few different heroes that can apply fears. It's not very common. It's also important to know that when a unit is feared, they can also be hit with stuns and slows and stuff like that. So they're pretty damn vulnerable. They're kind of of running away, they're not really in control of themselves, and you can still stun them, hit them, and kind of do what you got to do to take that team fight. But a very unique skill, not one that's not very common in Dota. It's one of the least common ones, but still very impactful in a team fight. Rooting. Wow, I'm going to use an item here as an example. Rooting prevents the movement, but you can still attack, you can still use abilities, and you can still use items. Generally speaking, there are some roots that don't, and we'll talk about that in a second. But movement-based abilities cannot happen. So, for instance, if you have, if let's say, you are Lina and you are rooted, you can cast Laguna Blade, you can cast LSA, all those things, but you can't move anywhere. If you are Queen of Pain, you could Scream of Pain, you can Sonic Wave, but you can't blink. You can't use a movement skill or ability, but you can use other abilities, okay? Some roots also disarm their target, which is unique. So, for instance, Frostbite from Crystal Maiden actually is a root, but also a disarm at the same time, which can confuse new players. So, a hero hit by Frostbite cannot actually return an attack, and they are rooted. But that is an impact of the skill that is unique to that skill. A Rod of Eidos, for instance, will just root the target, but not dispel them. Not dispel. Disarm them. Sorry, I read dispel down here. It will not interrupt channeled spells, but rooting will prevent Boots of Travel or Town portal scrolls from occurring. Okay, very important to know. So if someone's trying to TP away in your Crystal Maiden, you can Frostbite them, which holds them in place and prevents them from running away. Leash is very similar to kind of the restricted movement that we were just speaking about. Leash will not disable units, but it rather restricts their movement to a confined space. The best example of this is Pounce by Slark. You also have Dream Coil by Puck. And what they basically do is they basically make it so you gotta move within that space, right? You can't use mobility spells. Your movement's constricted, and basically you can still fight though. I see this in a lot of new games. New players, they get pounced on by Slark and they try to run away. And they just sit there and they let Slark pound on them, and they're like, I'm trying to run, and they can't run. Just turn and hit him, man fight him, right? If you're restricted, if you're leashed anyway, just man fight the guy. And so a lot of people do forget that because the leash duration is like 3.5 seconds. It's about just over 3 seconds at level 4, 2.5 seconds, which is pretty significant at level 1. That's kill potential range, right? So Pounce, very effective. You see a lot of Slark in lower MMR, so you're going to see it. So just be aware that if you're leashed, you can still attack. You're just constricted with your movement. Hex. Hex is very unique. Hex silences, mutes, and disarms the target and turns them into a little critter. You can still move. Movement's reduced, but you can't attack, you can't use abilities, you can't use items. If you use a BKB before, or Lincoln's, you'll be protected from the Hex itself, but if you didn't, you can move around as a little chicken or a little frog if it's a lion, and you can hope you don't get murked because at the end of the day, you're just a little critter. Hex movement, they can still move. Hexes do require strong dispels to dispel, so like Slark's Dark Pact will dispel a Hex. Press the Attack from Legion Commander will dispel a Hex, but Hex will also immediately destroy an illusion. Disarms. We were talking about this before about how some roots like Crystal Maidens, Frostbite will apply disarms. An item, a very popular item called Heaven's Halberd will provide a disarm as well. It's an active, which will give a melee target or a ranged target a time frame where they cannot attack. Movement's normal, ability usage is normal, item usage is normal, attack usage no go. You cannot right click, you cannot attack. You can still cast spells. Disarm is very valuable if you are against right click centric heroes like Drow Ranger or even like a Faceless Void, Spectre, other guys that kind of just they come up on you and they just hit you till you can't get hit anymore. A disarm effect like Heaven's Halberd is a great opportunity to give your team some added survivability. An excellent item for pretty much anybody, really. Very strong item. Again, disarming prevents attacks. Ethereal. So what this basically does is it prevents physical damage from being applied to the target. However, they become more vulnerable to spells. This is a little more complex. I saved it to one of the last ones here. Let's take Decrepify by Pugna as an example. So it has a different effect whether it is on allies or on enemies. You can use Decrepify to save an ally, right? They will have, basically they won't have a movement slow, but they have, they take increased damage by spells, but they can't get killed by physical attacks. So they take 25% increased damage from spells, no physical damage, and they're not slowed. If you cast it on an enemy, not only are they slowed very significantly, they also have a higher rate of magic resistance reduction. So it is one of the interesting spells that you can cast on allies, but the ally one's like, yeah, you're taking a little more, magic damage, but you're okay. It's not too bad, unless you're against Lena. But for enemies, it is like brutal. It's like, oh, you're slowed, you're taking almost double the damage of what the allies are taking. It's pretty rough. Ghost Scepter, which is an item used on a lot of supports to kind of add survivability or to build E-Blade on other lineups. It does not reduce movement speed, so it can be used like if like a Phantom Assassin jumps on you as a support, you can Ghost Scepter, activate Ghost Scepter, and run to safety, or get that added survivability you might need so you don't get killed right away. But Pugna's Decrepify is a perfect example of this disable in play. The last one we're going to talk about is Taunt, baby! Berserker's Call. Berserker's Call is one of the funniest things you can do in a game. When you get a great call off, just like Seb, what ends up happening is you get an absolutely fantastic reward of watching all the opponents being forced to attack you. Okay, hold on. Let me explain this clearly. I just got too excited because the famous Seb call, right? So, movement, forced. They are forced to move towards you. Attack, they are forced to attack you. They are prevented from using abilities and prevented from using items. Berserker's Call from Axe is a perfect example of this, and it's synergized with Blade Mail. So what Axe does is he pops his Blade Mail, so if you hit him, you take damage. He Berserker's Calls you, you're forced to hit him, you're taking damage from Blade Mail the entire time, and you cannot run away, you can't hit anyone else. The opposing team can hit you as they wish. You are forcing all your attention on Axe. Taunting is truly fantastic. It can be a game-winning ability. As I talked about, like in the TI championships, right? Seb famously jumped in on a play, got an amazing Berserker's Call, and it had a major turning point effect on the match in the tournament. So that's what I was referencing to before. So Berserker's Call and Taunt specifically has a lot of opportunity. Legion Commander taunts as well with Duel, which is fantastic. So bear that in mind. An absolutely fantastic ability. That is it for today's video. If you have any questions, let me know. In the next video, we'll be talking about Dota 2's glossary terms, so you know what all the words mean, so you can keep up with the lingo. Thank you so much for watching, and a very special thank you to all of my wonderful subscribers. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you soon.